The House comes to questions for oral answer. Question number 1 in the name of Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. What were the estimates given to him in his conversations with banks about the number of dairy farmers that are likely to go into receivership and leave the land?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I wasn't given a precise estimate, but the sense I was left with was that it would be modest.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
From the advice he has received, how many dairy farmers does he think will be forced off the land?
Speaker,
the Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I don't know, but what I do know is that the Reserve Bank has released its stress testing. And what the stress testing actually shows is that even under a very dire scenario where land prices fell 40%, that the banks would be very strong and they would be in a position to continue lending to their existing borrowers. In other words, finance those banks through a difficult downturn.
Supplementary question, David Seymour.
Has the Prime Minister thought of just making Fonterra put up the payout?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Sadly, that's not within my control, but I'm sure the Labor Party will have that as a policy by tomorrow afternoon.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question. Order. 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 Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Does he agree with the Reserve Bank that up to 25% of dairy debt, or almost $10 billion, will be written off, which means hundreds of dairy farmers will be forced off the land?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, I haven't seen those comments by the Reserve Bank. You want to make sure that you're quoting them correctly. Well, that's not in the press release from the Reserve Bank.
Supplementary.
To the Prime Minister.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Is he at all concerned about the Reserve Bank's projection that dairy land values will crash by between 25% and 40%, which will undermine the livelihoods of thousands of Kiwis?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
That is the problem with the Leader of the Opposition, is that you can't take him seriously when he actually misrepresents the Reserve Bank Governor. The Reserve Bank Governor is not saying there's a projection that land prices will drop 25 to 40%. He's doing a stress test to say what would happen if land prices went down. There's Reserve bankers do that all the time because their prudential requirements require them to make sure the banking system is strong. And what he's saying is, even under a worse scenario like this, the banking system is very strong.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Has the Prime Minister actually read the Reserve Bank's report released at 2 p.m. today? And if so, has he read it?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
No, what I've read is the release, because the press release, it came out at 2 o'clock today. I only got this 1 minute before I came here. But, Mr Speaker, what the release says quite clearly is, A, the banking system is very strong. B, under their worst case scenarios, that, to quote, the test results suggest that in the shorter term, banks would increase their dairy lending in order to support existing borrowers. And it's saying that even in the worst scenario, the losses could be between 3 and 8% of their total dairy exposure. Banks have considerably more exposure than just this. And as the member was pointing out yesterday, banks have been making pretty good money. They can afford, if they have to, take some losses in that sector.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Does he agree with MYOB that, quotes, approximately 100,000 businesses employing upwards of 1 million New Zealanders are facing reducing revenue because of the dairy downturn, end quotes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I don't have anything to back that up. I'd need to see the analysis, but it could be as small as a business that's affected, from someone that sells sandwiches to someone that works in that area. There's a very large range of businesses in that sector.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Is it fair that our dairy farmers go bankrupt and 100,000 small businesses face reduced revenue while overseas-owned banks continue to make $90 million a week and speculators circle over our farmland?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The member is, I think, terribly confused about what's happening. What you've got is a scenario where dairy prices are lower And what we should be doing is supporting dairy farmers with the things that we can control. We can't control the exchange rate, and we cannot control commodity prices, and we cannot control the weather. We can control free trade agreements, planning laws, health and safety, RMA reform and a variety of other things. And on this side of the House, we support helping those farmers, actually in good times and in bad.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. Order. Question number 2. Order.